Trump is extraordinarily, meteoric. So he can say three different things before breakfast. But the fact is that he has a political view, which is he wants to do as much damage, obviously, to Biden as possible. And that basically involves a complete using the Republican forces in the House to stop him doing whatever he wants. And it's intensely transactional. And the idea that David Cameron would get him to change his mind is strictly for the birds.
And this morning, we're joined by the Sunday Times columnist Dominic Lawson and the former Labour and then Independent MP Dame Louise Ellman.
Lots to talk about. We're going to examine the Foreign Secretary David Cameron's trip to Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago complex and then on to Washington, D.C. Can he move the former and perhaps future president to support Ukraine? David Cameron is also going to meet his American counterpart, Antony Blinken, today. What can they do about Gaza?
Meanwhile, the Labour Party has found a new way of generating money. It seems a bit like their old suggestion of picking the pockets of non-DOMs. They're going to close down some loopholes, but are their plans realistic?
And are table manners still worth bothering about anymore?
Right, well, good morning, Dominic. Good morning. Oh, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
Yes.
Good morning. And good morning, Dame Louise.
Good morning.
Let's start off with a big trip by Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron to America. Now, originally he was scheduled to just meet members of the Biden administration, but then he took a 1,000-mile detour to pay homage at the court of Donald Trump. He met the former and maybe future president for dinner yesterday at Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. Now, David Cameron wants to persuade Donald Trump to throw his weight behind support for Ukraine. Many Republicans in the Congress are very much opposed to sending billions of dollars to help fight the war in Russia, but they might change their minds if Donald Trump tells them to. Earlier, Adam spoke with Caitlin Doornbos. She's a Washington reporter for the New York Times. She told us that David Cameron had a task ahead of him, but that this meeting might be a first step.
It's a tough sell. I was a little bit surprised to see that Trump had agreed to a meeting. I mean, David Cameron really wants to meet with the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, and that's really unclear at this point. So I think the fact that Trump accepted an invitation to speak with David Cameron goes a long way.
So, Dominic, I'm going to come to you first. I mean, what do you think about David Cameron's trip, about him going to see Donald Trump, and then of course he's got big work to do with the Biden administration in terms of Gaza? Do you think he's going to sort of persuade Donald Trump to change his mind on Ukraine?
No, and I don't think anyone that you have spoken to would say that there's a slightest chance. Although, of course, Trump is extraordinarily, meteoric. So he can say three different things before breakfast. But the fact is that he has a political view, which is he wants to do as much damage, obviously, to Biden as possible. And that basically involves a complete using the Republican forces in the House to stop him doing whatever he wants. And it's intensely transactional. And the idea that David Cameron would get him to change his mind is strictly for the birds. And I don't know whether you've referred to this earlier, but you might remember that a couple of months ago, he wrote a piece for The Hill, which was the congressional newspaper record, where he basically said to Republicans, if you don't do this, you're really like the appeasers of Hitler. And I thought, it was staggering that he thought that upbraiding him in this way, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton upbraiding him in this way, would have anything other than a possibly negative effect, just as when he brought Obama over here during the Brexit campaign and got Obama to lecture us on what we should do in the referendum. If anything, it had a negative effect. And I'm rather surprised that he thought that it would have any other effect. But I mean, I don't want to be cynical, but I think Cameron has a very short time in this office. He's setting his own legacy. He's running his own campaign to establish his own legacy. And this is what it's about, in my view.
Well, we've just had a little bit of breaking news coming in. This is from the Metropolitan Police. A murder investigation has been launched after a woman was found dead in her home with stab wounds in Bayswater in London. We'll bring you all the information on this developing story as we get it. And let's move on now to the main story on the front of the Times today. This is the question of non-DOMs. Rachel Reeves is saying that she can close loopholes that the Conservatives have left in their move against non-DOMs to finance Labour's spending plans. How is Labour going to pay for these extra spending promises? The answer used to be abolish non-dom tax status. Then the Conservatives' Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said he was going to do the same. So what now? This morning I spoke to James Murray, Labour Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury.
It's not about increasing any taxes. It's about making sure people pay the tax they should be paying when you're talking about HMRC compliance. That money would raise about, over the course of the next Parliament, about twice what we would need, actually, for our commitments on NHS, dentistry and breakfast clubs. But that's why we're confident that there is money in the plans we've set out to fund those commitments we've already made.
Let's go to Louise Ellman. Are you convinced by this? Do you think that a small magic money tree has been found in these loopholes?
Well, I think that Rachel Reeves is being quite realistic, and she's not promising massive transformation from this. But she is saying that she will be able to focus additional funding on specific areas which will make a difference to a lot of people, such as free breakfast clubs for primary school children, lots of kids going to school hungry. Expanding that would help a lot of people. It won't change the world, but it will change things for those people. Also, better funding for emergency healthcare. Again, it helps those people who get it. It won't transform everything. And I think she's right to do that, to focus on specifics, not promise massive change, but focus on change where it can be achieved. And of course, she's not only talking about the detail of the non-dom tax, which has already been announced by this government. She's looked at the detail of that to see where that can be changed. But she's also talking about tax avoidance and doing something about that as well. So I think in the circumstances where we are in such a dire financial situation, it is the right approach. It's not promising the world. It's focusing on where money can be found and directing it to very specific issues which will affect a large number of people, even if it won't change their whole lives.
I have to say we've had a number of listeners messaging us saying, how can Labour lecture about the money they're going to raise from tax avoidance when its deputy leader is not being transparent about her own affairs and stands accused of avoiding tax herself?
Well, this seems very much like a smear campaign to me. It's been going on a long time now. And it seems to be that when allegations are made, they're not proven, then a new story emerges along the same theme. But really, this is an issue for the relevant authorities. And if something wrong has been done, it's for the relevant tax authorities or the police authorities to investigate, as indeed they're looking at, and take action where appropriate. But I think what's being attempted now is a political smear and a new angle on this today, which doesn't really add to the substance. But it's a matter for investigation by the authorities responsible.
But you say it hasn't been proven that the deputy leader avoided paying tax on a house sale. The problem is it hasn't been dispelled either. Would you like to see her produce the evidence which she says she had of the advice she received?
I think what she said on that is quite right. If everybody is going to produce all the advice they've had, everyone in politics, including the government, then that's a new way of doing things, and that's all right. Otherwise, what will that achieve? I suspect that whatever that says will open up new issues, and advice people get is advice, and everybody knows that. You seek professional advice if you have an issue you're looking at, and usually advice suggests possibilities one way or another. It's very rarely absolutely definitive. Maybe this is, but if everyone's going to have to show their tax advice, then I agree it should be done. But I think this is really an attempt just to have a story that keeps going and going and going, and I think it can only be resolved when the appropriate authorities decide whether the action is needed or whether no action at all is needed.
Dominic Lawson, what's your thoughts on this Angela Rayner story? A non-story, or do you think there's more to it that meets the eye?
Well, I do think, as Adam said, it's odd that she hasn't published the advice that she says that she received. By the way, this advice was not advice given at the time of the transactions, which some people think. It was advice that she only took advice after the story broke. Um, and she says the advice is clear. And now Dan Needle, who is the kind of leading expert on this, and who, by the way, was the man responsible for bringing to light the Nadim Zahawi tax row situation, which cost him his job. Dan Needle says it's very clear to him, and his whole career has been on this form of tax advice. He said it's very clear to him that tax which should have been paid has not been paid. Now, it's a very small amount, he said, about £1,500. But still, I think the point raised that if you are as a party saying we are campaigning on the eradication of loopholes and tax avoidance, and your deputy leader is prima facie in breach of those laws, you do have a problem. And I don't agree with Louise Ellman that that is a non-story.
One of our listeners has messaged in saying if everyone in the country did a £1,500 tax dodge, then that would fund education or defence for a year. I mean, Dame Louise, isn't the difficulty with this story for Labour? Labour is, and Keir Starmer is positioning himself as, you know, he as a former chief prosecutor of the country is saying, you know, we stand for integrity. We have to be ruthlessly transparent about everything. Doesn't it just look a bit strange that Angela Rayner isn't publishing the advice, and even Keir Starmer, who's a very distinguished lawyer, has not seen the advice?
I don't think it is strange. I think that if everyone was to publish everyone in politics was to publish all the advice they've got, that would be okay. But, you know, if somebody is trying to keep a story going, even if it doesn't have real substance, advice that's received can then be debated and discussed. There could be a different advisor who has different advice, and it can still go on and on and on if the aim is to have a smear. And I go back to what I said at the beginning. If there's a problem, the relevant authorities have to look at it closely and to take action. And indeed, they are looking at it.
And Dominic, just come back to you about Labour's idea about closing down these loopholes in the non-dom policy, which was sort of nicked by the Conservative Party. What do you think about this idea for Labour to find some more money?
Well, I mean, of course, because Jeremy Hunt shot their fox, that was upsetting for them, and particularly because of the former status of Akshata Murthy, the Prime Minister's wife, they will want to make this still an election issue, even though the amount involved that they're saying they would save is not something that actually you would notice. It's pitiably small. I would say one thing, just to uphold the honour of the Lawsons, it actually was my father, when he was Chancellor, who wanted to eradicate the non-dom status. Margaret Thatcher blocked it, and Jeremy Hunt told me that, in fact, that's where he had got the idea. But of course, it does have the appearance of taking Labour's policies, and parties do this now all the time.
Speaking of the honour of the Lawsons, your father, Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor, was told in the recent major economic speech by Rachel Reeves that he was wrong. And you found it rather surprising that the economist who she pointed towards as being her model was former Cambridge economist called Joan Robinson. What's wrong with Joan Robinson?
Well, what surprised me was that she cited Joan Robinson as someone who understood that the purpose of economics was not sort of abstract theorizing, but morality, the good life, principle. And Joan Robinson was this country's leading advocate of Maoism. She supported the Great Leap Forward, which actually was the collectivization of agriculture, which caused, it's estimated by historians now, the starvation of 50 million Chinese. And Joan Robinson was rather cross, and said she was quite cross, when there was some relaxation in this policy. And she also supported the Cultural Revolution, which actually viewers of the three-body problem would see on our screens now a sort of semi-fictionalized account, but it was the most astonishing outbreak of barbarism. And she supported all of this. She never recanted it. And I actually don't think that Rachel Reeves knew any of this. I don't think that her researchers knew any of this. And I think it shows, I'm afraid, the lamentable lack of historical perspective and knowledge on the part of so many politicians today.
Rachel Reeves is presented as one of the big brains of Labour. Do you think that's what Dominic Lawson's fair, Louise Ellman?
I think that Rachel Reeves is addressing the issue very well indeed. She understands very clearly there aren't large amounts of money available. She's determined to make changes. She wants to be cautious. She's pinpointing exactly where funding can be found for very specific policies. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do.
But why praise a Maoist? Why praise a Maoist in a major economic speech?
Well, I think she has to say why she made that quote. I think she was looking at The Economist, and she wasn't looking at other views that person indeed may well have had. It was looking at The Economist and the views.
Right, well, plenty more to come in our panel. Just read out some messages that we've been having in. John's message and saying there's a bigger issue in place than just the £1,500 for Angela Rayner. If you don't live in the council house you purchased for 5 years before you sell it, you lose some of the discount. That is a much larger sum. Simon in Liverpool's message and saying, I'd love to see the Prime Minister's wife abundant tax advice published, non-story. And Peter from Oxford's message and saying it's pathetic that the Tories are so desperate to smear Angela Rayner for such a small amount of money when she wasn't even an MP, yet no one is talking about the utter corruption and lies over the PPE scams, and Nadeem Zahawi tried to avoid millions of pounds in tax payments. That's a message from Peter. Do keep your comments coming in. You can text 87222, start your message with the word Times. You can tweet us at Times Radio, or you can WhatsApp us on 0333 003 2353. You're listening to Breakfast on Times Radio with Adam Bolton and Aisha Hazarika in association with Nationwide, a good way to bank.
Jane Garvey and Fee Glover on Times Radio.
If you've got a question burning deep inside you about insulating your home, our programme gives you an opportunity to release it. It's a Call the Expert special.
Well, that's an offer. And we have a great interview, well, I hope it'll be great, with Anthony Horowitz, the screenwriter and novelist. He's got a new book out. It's set in Richmond upon Thames. It stars Detective Daniel Hawthorne, and it's called Close to Death.
This afternoon from 3 on Times Radio.
This isn't your first rodeo. You know running a business means wearing many hats. Whether you're riding waves of new opportunity or searching out new customers, there's always another job waiting. But when it's time to put your money hat on, try the bank built especially for established businesses. You'll get your own dedicated relationship manager and no monthly fees. It's how business banking used to be, just better. Get no-nonsense business banking with Alika Bank. Alika Bank is authorised by the PRA and regulated by the PRA and FCA. T's and C's apply. Visit alika.bank.
Do you know an ambitious business leader? Someone who is leading a growing UK business, creating a great place to work, contributing to a sustainable future, or expanding internationally? If the answer is yes, we want to hear from you. Nominate yourself or someone else for the LDC Top 50 Most Ambitious Business Leaders 2024. Visit ldc.co.uk/radio to nominate by Monday the 29th of April. Winners will be revealed in the Times in October. ldc.co.uk/radio.
Listen to The Story with Manveen Rana, Luke Jones and William Hague. One remarkable story told in depth each day. Find it in the Times Radio app or wherever you listen to podcasts. Times Radio Breakfast with Nationwide. A branch manager in every branch, because face-to-face banking matters.
Welcome back. Adam Bolton, Aisha Hazarika here. We're talking about the day's news with Dominic Lawson and Dame Louise Ellman. Now, when Rishi Sunak took on Liz Truss to become the Conservative leader and Prime Minister with it, one of his policy suggestions was to fine people £10 for missing a GP appointment. It hasn't happened here yet, but in France, the Prime Minister Gabriel Attal announced that his government wants to enforce a €5 fine for missed appointments. We spoke to Benedict Paviot, UK correspondent for France 24 earlier.
Apparently there are some 27 million GP appointments that are missed every single year. And that's why this Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, wants a €5 fine if people don't turn up or don't, within 24 hours before, cancel their appointments. There's an interesting phenomenon that both the UK and France have, is they've got ageing populations. They've also got a problem, while in France, of désert médical, which is a medical desert, where the availability of GPs in certain counties, we'll call them, départements, is not sufficient.
I don't know. I went to see a French GP last year. Excellent service, but it did cost 50p just for 50 euros just for the appointment.
50p is fine.
50 euros just for the appointment. So €5 for missing it seems like a bargain. But I mean, it's the principle that stands. Louise Ellman, a lot of people do have to queue up to see their GP and sometimes wait for weeks on end. Would it be a good idea to find those people who don't turn up?
No, I don't like this idea at all, and I don't like the principle. I'm concerned that it would have vulnerable people who are very worried and then don't try and make an appointment because they get worried that they think they might be too ill to go, and people behave in a way that's very concerning when they're distressed. So I don't like this idea at all. But I do think a lot needs to change in the whole system of appointments. You know, very often people have to use technical systems to make appointments, and some people just want to speak to a human to help them to do it. But no, I don't like the idea of fines. I think it's arbitrary, and I think the vulnerable could suffer from it.
Dominic Lawson, people are finding it difficult to get an appointment. Would this help for those people who really need it?
Well, actually, I agree with Louise on this, and I think that when you think how scandalously difficult it is to get an appointment, it's adding insult to injury. By the way, I don't want to deviate too much, but it's very interesting because we saw the new Irish president leader talking about he wanted a united Ireland, and one of the things which is not mentioned in this is that, of course, in Ireland, they have the same thing that you encountered in France, Adam. You pay about 60 euros for a GP appointment. And in Northern Ireland, they don't, of course. It's free on the NHS. And I've always thought the one reason why there would never be reunification is because the people of Northern Ireland, including many Catholics, would not want to go to a system where they have to pay 50 euros to see their GP. And I do agree. In any case, a small fine, the bureaucratic and administrative costs of actually running it would probably exceed any revenues they might get. So I think it's a complete non-starter.
I mean, Simon Harris, the new Taoiseach, to be fair to him, he's going to be sworn in today. He did say that United Ireland wasn't his priority. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why.
Well, I think, yes, he has other things on his plate, but nonetheless, he said it was their aspiration. The issue was one of timing. But as I said, I think that this is probably a thing that is never mentioned. But I think it's the single biggest reason why it's very unlikely to happen.
Okay. Do you have any positive suggestion as to how it can be made easier for people to get access to a GP?
Well, I think that, I mean, we do have now the ability to see our GPs through the device that I'm seeing you, Adam, and that actually, I think, for many cases, makes it easier. But it's a deeply contentious issue. But I think that clearly the whole thing has changed since the days when GPs would come and visit you in home. And I remember that the first time I moved down here in darker Sussex, GPs would visit in your home. It was an amazing and wonderful thing. It simply doesn't happen anymore. We live in a different society, and one which I guess many of us regret has changed in the way it has.
Sam from Nottingham has messaged in saying, I rang up at 8 o'clock in the morning to cancel my 1 p.m. appointment, and 1 hour and 25 minutes later, and I still can't get through. Dame Louise, before we leave this topic, just on Adam's point about what could be done to make people value their appointments more and turn up more, because you do speak to people in the NHS and they do say the missed appointments, particularly with GPs, is a real problem. One idea that I've heard floated is that people should be told how much their treatment would cost if it was done privately. So, you've got this GP's appointment, this is worth £50 or £60, just so you know. Do you think that could maybe motivate people to keep their appointments?
I'm not sure that would really make much difference to people. I'm not sure they're thinking that way. But I think that where appointments are being missed, people should be reminded that appointments are valuable, that other people want them, and that if they don't need the appointment, they should say so. But in many cases, people do need those appointments and they do want to go, and there are genuine reasons people can't make it. And of course, people don't always have to see their GPs. It depends what the problem is. There may be other medical people who can deal with their issue as well. But I think it should be made easier, not more difficult, for people to get appropriate medical attention when they need it, and to speak to a human being, not just have to use technology to be able to do it.
Now, let's move on to our final topic. We've had a lot of traffic, if you pardon the pun, in about this topic today, and this is about parking your car. Is parking your car getting harder, or are cars just getting bigger, or are parking bays getting smaller? We spoke with Ben Clatworthy earlier. He's our transport correspondent from the Times. He actually said that cars are actually getting bigger, and it means that a new study's found that motorists have just an average of about 30 centimetres, which is the size of a cereal box, between the side of their car and the edge of the parking bay. And a fifth of correspondents also claimed that they are so squeezed in that they have resorted to climbing into their car via their boot at least once. Dominic, what do you think about this conundrum?
Yeah, that made me laugh. The thought was 20% of the British population getting into their car via their boots. I haven't seen it, but I believe it. Well, I mean, I think if you think about it, the Mini, so-called Mini, is now, according to the story in the Times, 34 centimetres wider than it was when it started. It shouldn't be called a Mini. It's ridiculous. And of course, I think that, I mean, to be serious, there are reasons, because the cars are lighter, they use much lighter materials, so they can be relatively fuel efficient while being physically much larger. The paradox is, it always intrigues me, that our homes are getting smaller and smaller while our cars are getting bigger and bigger. And apparently our living rooms of new builds are now about 30% smaller than 1970. And I think we'll get to the stage now where people's cars will be about as big as their living rooms, and they might as well live in their cars.
I love that. You're so right about houses and new builds. I was having that discussion. Apparently, like, new builds are getting smaller and smaller, and hardly any storage space as well, which is a real problem for families. Dame Louise, what's your parking like? Do you find it easy to kind of shimmy into a parking space, or do you agree with this survey?
Well, I've not had recent personal experience of this. I don't drive now, and I use public transport. But clearly, people do need to use cars. They do need to be able to park. And if this is the problem, the spaces have to take account of it. But let's get public transport working better as well. Not instead of making it possible for people to park, but let's make sure that the buses, which are now coming under the control of local authorities, do run rather better, that the trains run better, and that transport can be integrated so that people can get around without having to squeeze into those small parking spaces.
And final question to you, Dominic. You can settle a kind of a discussion that Adam has been having with the great British public. Is it better when you're in a parking space to go in nose first or reverse into the parking space? What's the correct thing to do?
Strictly speaking, you should reverse, but I am a nose firster, I think, because I tend to be in a hurry.
Right.
So, but I realise when I look back at the railway station, and I see that I am one of the very few nose firsters. I'm the oppressed minority.
It should be said we've got a listener who tells us that all military and security vehicles are required to reverse in and drive out for a quick getaway. It's easier to reverse into a tight space than drive in because of front wheel steering. It's also safer driving out of a space than reversing into traffic. Well, I'd say, what if you've got four-wheel drive?
Yeah, wow. I do. So the first of those arguments doesn't apply.
Callum has just messaged in. I'm sure it's not Callum McDonald. I'm sure it's another Callum. He says people are bigger too, so spaces will need to go all the way to the US and go super. I mean, maybe that is something as we all get bigger. I mean, we have got an obesity problem. Maybe everything's just going to get bigger.
And think of it, Aisha. Here's the problem: if we're getting bigger and bigger, it's even more difficult for us to get our corpulent physiques into the tiny aperture between the cars. And we could actually expire in this position.
Well, I've got visions of people not making it, trying to shimmy in through their boot.
I've got to confess, I have on occasions had to get in through the boot or through the passenger door in order to drive.
Adam,
because people park so close, you see, in these tiny spaces.
Honestly, Adam, you've actually climbed in through the boot.
I have, yeah.
Okay, we need, Angie Hunter, if you're listening, we need footage of this. We have to have footage of Adam Bolton clambering very elegantly into his car. Well, look, that's it for the panel this morning. My huge thanks to Dame Louise Ellman and to Dominic Lawson. That was a really excellent chat.